Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Cloyd. I'm one of the co-chairs of West County Democrats. I have a couple of announcements. We have an opportunity for someone to be trained to help Mark with our technology. If anybody would like to be an assistant with that, please let one of us know, or you could email us and we will get you set up, because apparently Mark would like to leave town on occasion the second Monday of the month. And I mentioned that really wasn't allowed, but apparently I was overruled. So if you are interested in that, please let us know. Alexa tells me that we are 81 days into the Biden presidency, or the Biden-Harris administration. I'm looking forward to see what he and his administration can accomplish in the next 19 days, so we can feel good about what we've accomplished thus far. I know for a fact I don't check Twitter first thing in the morning like I used to do the previous 3.5, 4 years. It's nice not having to check to see what Trump has done or who he's managed to anger or anything of that kind. But we're glad you're here with us today. I think we will have a very interesting conversation. Glenn also has a legislative report. I read it beforehand, so I would not make funny faces on video. My students used to tell me I made really funny faces when somebody said something off kilter in class, so I've already done that. We are glad that you're here with us this morning. If you would, please take the opportunity to mute yourself if you haven't already. That would be greatly appreciated. I hope my dog complies. I've tried to mute her. We'll have to see if that works. You should have received the March minutes in your email. If you find something that needs correcting, please let us know. And we'll just go on with the membership report. There's Gay.
Good morning, everyone. It's Gay Meekum. We now have 87 paid members for this year. We are obviously still collecting dues. It's $20 a year. Obviously, things are a little slower because we're doing everything virtual, but keep the checks coming and keep enjoying our meetings. If you are sending in the $20 check, mail it to West County Dems, P.O. Box 31034, St. Louis, Missouri 63131. We also have some new members who joined us recently in the last few months, and I hope I don't destroy their names when I'm saying them. But we have Julie Bomans, and we have Nancy Copenhagen from Moberly, Missouri joining us, and we have Deborah Lynn. So welcome to those three, and tell your friends about us. That's about our report.
Okay, thank you very much, Gay. Moving right along with the treasurer's report.
Hi, good morning. Yeah. Good morning. We have the treasurer's report for the month of March. We had a beginning balance of $6,048.73. We had revenue of $380, $300 in memberships, and $80 was donations. Our disbursements were $200 for honorariums, and our ending balance as of March 31st, 2021 was $6,228.73.
Okay. Thank you. I did just put the post office box in zip in the chat box if you need that to mail your membership dues. Okay, next we have program report. Suzanne, my co-chair.
Yes, we're going to be working on some new speakers. As you know, Erlene has taken a leave of absence, so Karen and I are working very diligently trying to find our speakers going on. Also, we are looking at having our meeting in July in one of the parks around. So we would be meeting in a park and getting together and actually seeing each other live, which would be a wonderful thing. If any of you have any suggestions of a place, we're looking currently at Queenie because it is so close to where we normally meet. But if you have suggestion on something else, please let me know. Anyway, we're working on that and we'll have more about that in May.
I see Jessica Labazetta is on the call. She has probably some information regarding that. I may give you a buzz, Jessica, and see what you know. Okay. All right. Thank you. Oh, Suzanne, we're not finished with you. You're up. Would you care to introduce our speaker for this morning?
Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Kimball. He's a professor and interim chair of political science at UMSL. He is an author, an editor, and a teacher of courses in American government, political behavior, parties and elections, and interest groups. He has participated in court cases on election administration, voting, and rights and redistricting. We are happy to have him here. We'll turn it over to Dr. Kimball now.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you all for inviting me to be here this morning. I'm gonna see if I can share my screen. There we go. Let's see if this works. Okay, so my area of expertise is in American government and in voting and elections specifically. I guess lately I've been thinking a lot about, as I'll show you in a bit here, we're seeing a record number of bills proposing to change election laws in states around the country and in Congress. And so I'm going to talk a little bit sort of about that and why it's happening and what it means. And I'll leave time for Q&A and happy to answer any questions about current events in politics in Missouri or the nation at the end. Okay, so a little background how we got here. We're a very closely divided nation. I'm sure you're all aware of that if you've been following politics. The photograph here is from over about a year and a half ago, October of 2019, back when Donald Trump was still president, before his impeachment. This was the last time that President Trump and Speaker Nancy Pelosi met, and we think maybe it's even the last time that they've spoken to one another, even though there was over a year left in the president's term. And I show this to just sort of illustrate, how divided we are as a country. I'm interested in elections, and if we look at presidential elections over the last 20 years, they've all been pretty close, except for maybe the 2008 presidential election. President Obama won that pretty comfortably, but all the other ones have been close. Same with our midterm elections, so that every cycle, each party thinks that it has a good shot at winning the next national election, winning a majority of seats in Congress, winning the White House. And so each major party is looking for an edge to help win the next election. Another feature of our elections is that voter turnout is uneven. That we see higher turnout among wealthier Americans than among low-income Americans. We see higher turnout, especially among older people than among young adults. I didn't put it in the chart here. These numbers, by the way, are voter turnout figures from the 2016 presidential election, but we see similar patterns from 2020, just the numbers overall are higher. Voter turnout is also tends to be higher among white Americans than non-white Americans. these turnout figures fuel a belief among politicians in both parties that higher voter turnout, right? So let me back up. So the demographic groups that we see have lower turnout, younger people, low-income people, racial and ethnic minorities, right? Those are groups right now that tend to vote more for Democrats than Republicans. And so there's a belief among politicians in both parties that higher turnout helps the Democrats win elections and that lower turnout helps Republicans win elections. Now that the evidence is not nearly that clear on that. I think it's a misguided belief, but that's sort of the conventional wisdom in politicians among both parties. And so Republican politicians tend to then support policies that make voter registration and make voting more difficult, right? To maybe lower voter turnout, and Democratic politicians, by the same token, tend to promote policies that would make registration and voting easier. So that's sort of a little bit of background. So that background, there have been fights over election laws and administration going on for many years. It's really escalated in recent years, and these numbers come. So there's I highly recommend this book by Rick Hasson called Election Meltdown. If you're not familiar with it, he's a law professor at University of California at Irvine, and he's an expert, national expert on election law in the United States. He hosts a election law blog website that's really nice if you want to follow things, updates on what's going on in election law in the United States. Anyway, he's been tracking the number of lawsuits, specifically election lawsuits around the country. Before the 2000 election, that was the hanging Chad election in Florida, in which George W. Bush narrowly beat Al Gore. That election really sort of focused the minds of a lot of people in the United States around, election laws and election procedures and the voting equipment, and many of the details about election processes matter, and can possibly influence the outcome of election. And so that was sort of one inflection point after that led to a jump in election-related lawsuits challenging election policies and laws, and lawsuits challenging election outcomes. But they've also ramped up really dramatically in 2018, and then in 2020, they're still counting up the number of lawsuits, but it's over 500. The picture here, you may, this was after the 2020 election. This is the famous press conference outside the Four Seasons landscaping business in Philadelphia, where Rudy Giuliani claimed there was all this voter fraud in Pennsylvania in the 2020 presidential election. They still haven't produced any evidence of substantial voter fraud in Pennsylvania or in other states in the 2020 election. But so the number of lawsuits, right, so legal fights over election laws have really ramped up recently. The other thing, right, 2020, we held national elections in the midst of a global pandemic for the first time in about 100 years. And right, that really caused upheaval and uncertainty about the election. The picture here is from the city of Milwaukee. So Wisconsin held their primary election in early April of 2020, right in the early months of the breakout of the virus. Probably against the advice of health professionals. In Missouri, our municipal elections were scheduled for that same day, actually, and we postponed ours until June. The city of Milwaukee, which normally has 190 or so polling places, an election, only had 5 polling places in that April 2020 election. Because who wants to work as a poll worker and sit around a crowd of people indoors all day in the midst of a pandemic, right? So, so the 5 polling places they did have open had very long lines, and many people tried to vote by absentee ballot instead. But there were some logistical problems with that. And so the 2020 election, because of the virus, many voters were more interested in voting absentee, voting by mail, not having to come stand in line amidst a crowd of people. Shifting the voting procedures to account for the pandemic costs a lot of money. Congress in the first COVID relief bill passed in the spring of 2020 provided some funds to the states for election related adjustments. That was clearly not enough to prepare for the November 2020 election. So you may recall or seen news about this, that Mark Zuckerberg provided a bunch of money through a foundation. I think and some other foundations ended up kicking in about $500 million or so that was distributed to over 2,500 different local jurisdictions to help them prepare for the November 2020 election. Election administration in the United States is highly localized. You know, it's your county clerk or county election administrator who is responsible for choosing where the polling places are going to be and hiring poll workers and printing the ballots and setting up a system for absentee voting and so forth. And so local offices, you know, use that money in a variety of ways to get protective equipment, to pay their staff, you know, hazard pay, to help pay for increased postage for absentee ballots and so forth, you know, as best they saw fit to try and carry out a national election in the midst of a pandemic. We can talk more about this. I sort of have mixed feelings about the Zuckerberg money. I mean, on the one side, without that money, there would have been much more election chaos in 2020, and I really shudder to think what would have happened under those circumstances. But at least as a long-term solution, you know, it makes me a little bit nervous having private money funding our elections. Right? It should be state and federal government paying for those things, although to date, state and federal government have underfunded our election administration. So no surprise, the figure here shows the percentage of Americans, how they voted either in person on election day, an absentee vote submitted by mail, or voted in person at an early voting site before the election in green. And there's been a trend, even before 2020, there's been a trend away from election day voting. More and more Americans are choosing to vote either by mail or early, and more states have been expanding these options even before 2020. Obviously, the pandemic in 2020 really ramped this up, and so this was the first presidential election ever where more people voted absentee than voted on election day. Right, no surprise in the midst of a global pandemic. And I should just add, 2020, we also saw record voter turnout. About 67% of Americans voted in the presidential election last November. That is the highest voter turnout we've had in a presidential election in about 100 years. So it's a pretty remarkable, and I think some of the problems that many of us anticipated, you know, there's never a problem-free election. You know, there were places with long lines. There were places where ballot applications or ballots, you know, were delayed by the mail. But at least from my vantage point, these problems were not as bad as I was expecting them to be. And so pulling off a record turnout election in the midst of a global pandemic is a pretty amazing feat. And pulling off an election with record turnout in the midst of a pandemic with, at least so far, minimal irregularities, minuscule evidence of voter fraud. I've seen no evidence of voter fraud that was widespread enough to have changed the outcome of any the election in any of the states. You know, I think that this should be celebrated. Yeah, so that's kind of some background. Now, this is where we get to the unfortunate part, is that President Trump especially has, you know, pushed this rhetoric about voter fraud for many years now, even before he was elected in 2016. There's a University of California at Santa Barbara has compiled an archive of all of President Trump's tweets. If you're so inclined, you can go to their website and peruse them. Somebody's analyzed those tweets already and found that voter fraud, election fraud, was the most common topic of President Trump's tweets over his 4 years in the White House, right? Probably no surprise. Following the news, he is really, before he took office, you know, there had been rhetoric previously about voter fraud being widespread in the United States, despite evidence to the contrary, coming mainly from Republican politicians. But President Trump really ramped things up to a whole new level. And President Trump, right, is still has a widespread following among Republican voters, and that's taken a toll. That the Republican voters tend to believe President Trump more than what their own election officials, what the evidence or lack of evidence says instead. So the chart here summarizes public opinion surveys, national surveys conducted over the course from August of 2020 through February of 2021, asking how much confidence you have that the 2020 presidential election will be held fairly. For those asked before the election, and then after the election, they were asked how confident are you that the election was held fairly. And you notice a big shift from before to after the election. After the election, Republicans became less confident that the election was fair. Democrats became much more confident that the election was fair. We've seen this pattern in previous years where the winning side is more confident about the fairness of the election and the losing side is less confident. Sort of like if you're a sports fan and your team loses, you think the refs were bad, and if your team wins, you think the refs were great. But these differences are greater than we've seen previously. So President Trump has really led an effort to whip up public mistrust in our election laws and our election procedures where it's not warranted. And so that's what gets us to the current where we are today. So we're seeing lots of efforts to change election laws, and two main bills in Congress. One is H.R. 1, and the other is the John Lewis Act, named after former Congressman John Lewis, who died last year. These are both Democratic bills, so trying to expand access to voting. The John Lewis Act is more narrow, and it focuses on basically reviving the Voting Rights Act, and particularly responding to the Shelby. In 2013, the Supreme Court in the Shelby County court case decided that they issued a decision that weakened the Voting Rights Act. And the John Lewis Act would basically kind of reverse that decision, basically. I can sort of get into more of the details if you have questions about that. But HR 1 is the big one that it's over 800 pages long and has provisions dealing with redistricting, campaign finance, voter registration, voting equipment, polling place technology. That's not even the full list. And the House has already passed it, and I will, it's waiting on action in the Senate. I think part of the motive here for HR 1 is to try and preempt some of the bills that are being considered in many states, many Republican states, like Missouri, for example. I think my one, and many of the individual provisions I agree with. It would require redistricting to be done by independent commissions. It would require more disclosure of campaign finances, particularly dark money contributions. It would require automatic voter registration once you turn 18. For example, all these things I think are good policies. My concern is the implementation of it, that doing all of these things at once, and it gives states and counties a very short time frame to enact them. Doing all that at once really invites chaos. And so I'm a little nervous about that. I guess I sort of sympathize with election administrators who really struggled to pull off the 2020 election. And I would sort of maybe instead try and prioritize one or two things that are more doable in a shorter time frame, or allowing a 5-year period to phase these things in. So that's those are the two major bills at the federal level. We're seeing a lot of stuff going on at the state level. I've got the logo here for the Brennan Center for Justice. They're a really great organization to follow. They're interested in school rights, broadly speaking, not just in the voting area, but voting rights is the area that I follow. And they've been tracking election legislation around the country. And they do kind of like monthly updates on their website of what's going on. So last I checked, they counted over 361 bills that would restrict access to voting around the country. 3 states that have already passed these types of bills are Georgia, Iowa, and Arizona. You may have heard about some of this in the news. The Georgia one in particular has gotten a lot of attention. But at the same time, there are over 800 bills around the country that would expand voting rights, and these passed in New Jersey, New York, Virginia, for example, that would expand absentee or early voting, make voting registration easier, and so forth. You'll notice the 3 states, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, those are blue states. The 3 passing restricted bills, Georgia, Iowa, Arizona, are purple or red states. We're on a track here where Democratic run states, with a Democratic legislature, Democratic governor, are going to have one set of voting rules that are more accessible to voters, and then we're going to have in red states a different set of voting rules that are much more restrictive, kind of a 2 separate. I'm worried about where that's going to lead us. I think the other thing, well, so let me just say two broad things. I mean, I'm more concerned about the voting restrictions, particularly in the 3 states that have done this already, for 2 reasons, broadly speaking. One is they seem to be responding badly to losing the 2020 presidential elections. That is, these bills put restrictions on absentee voting. They put restrictions on earlier absentee votings, things that were successful in 2020 that helped produce this record turnout. And instead of celebrating an election where we had record turnout, decided no, that's actually a bad thing. We need to make it harder for people to vote, despite no evidence of significant voter fraud. I think that that's sort of troubling on its face. I think the other thing that's even more troubling to me is that in each of these 3 states, there are provisions that punish state or local election officials. And so on the screen, I've got the picture here of the man on the left is Brad Raffensperger, who's the Secretary of State of Georgia, a Republican. Prior to the 2020 election, he was a conservative Republican in good standing. Actually, he was a Republican that many Democrats and liberals did not like because he put in place some voting restrictions in Georgia, restrictive. But after the 2020 election, he resisted efforts by President Trump and other Republicans to not certify the election results in Georgia, and he refused to cow to that pressure. And the law that Georgia just passed removes him from the state election board that's responsible for counting and ultimately certifying the state's results, and reduces the Secretary of State's authority in other areas as well, and instead gives the state legislature greater oversight over election administration at the state and the county level in Georgia, which I think is just a dangerous thing to introduce even more partisan politics into the way elections are run. The other photograph on the screen, the woman on the right, is Barbara Sagaska, who's the Secretary of State of Nevada, also a Republican, also a very conservative Republican in good standing until the 2020 election. She similarly refused to cow to pressure from the president and his allies to stop the count or fail to certify the results. It refused to. She went ahead and certified the results in the Nevada's election in 2020, where Joe Biden won the popular vote as well. And just yesterday, the day before, the Republican Party of Nevada officially censured her. Right. I think it's very disturbing to see election officials be punished for doing their job and following the rules. That's a dangerous path to be on, to start doing that. The last thing, so Missouri, we're no exception to this. After the 2020 election, the Missouri legislature held a quick hearing that Rudy Giuliani appeared at virtually, right, to complain about voter fraud happening here and everywhere. And there are several bills moving through the Missouri legislature, some that would impose photo ID requirements. I've listed 2 of those bills, House Bill 738 and 334. One of those seems to me likely to advance pretty far this year. There's been a fight over photo ID requirements in Missouri for many years now. Probably know that you've been following this issue. The Missouri state constitution has a very explicit provision barring any infringement of the right to vote, and the state courts have pretty consistently held that a photo ID requirement is an infringement on the right to vote in Missouri, right? Absent any clear evidence that that there's voter impersonation fraud, and we haven't had a documented case of voter impersonation in Missouri going back at least 25 years, maybe even further. The state has had a really hard time, and the legislature has had a really hard time providing any evidence of that type of voter fraud, and voter impersonation is basically what the photo ID requirement is designed to prevent. And so the courts, the legislature keeps passing a photo ID requirement one way or another, or they get the voters to adopt it, and the courts keep striking it down. I think it's 738 is the one that basically combines a photo ID requirement with some expansion of early and absentee voting in the state. It's some effort at a compromise, and I think that's the one that may pass. But we also are seeing some bills, and I think this is more troubling to me, that would place restrictions on ballot measures. It would make it harder, require a higher fee to place a measure on the ballot, would require much more signatures in order to petition signatures to place a measure on the ballot, and would require for constitutional amendments a 2/3 vote to pass rather than a majority. I think the irony in this is that a good number of the constitutional amendments that are placed on the ballot in Missouri are placed there by the legislature, not by the petition process. And so far, I'm not seeing any bills that would make it harder for the legislature to place constitutional amendments on the ballot. So these measures seem strictly of an exercise in political power. Finally, I forgot to put the bill number, but there's also a pretty serious effort in the legislature to switch Missouri to closed primaries, which means that you have to be a registered Republican to vote in the Republican Party. You have to be a registered Democrat to vote in the Democratic Party, which would be a change from current practice, right? Currently, when there's a primary election and you walk into the polling place and check in, they ask you, do you want to, which party ballot do you want? And you can ask for whichever one you want, right? Basically, no questions asked. Closed primary would prevent that. You'd have to be registered with that party. The local election officials in Missouri are broadly against that because it would require a lot of work on their part to implement, right? Having to require everyone to register with a party is going to be a big undertaking. So that's another one. Not sure how that's going to go. One last thing here I'll add. Some of you may be familiar with the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. It's a really wonderful organization that's run by Denise Lieberman, who's an election lawyer, expert election lawyer. She really knows a lot. And they have weekly Zoom calls sort of to update on what's going on nationally, what's going on in Missouri. I can help provide information to join, but the sign here, if you text that MOVPC to that number on your cell phone, you can get signed up to join them. If you're interested in following election laws more closely, that's a good organization in Missouri to follow. So those are the things that I wanted to talk about, but I'm happy to take questions about election laws or about politics generally or anything else. So let me pause there and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
I have a question. This might sound really juvenile, I don't know. Anyway, just looking at the whole thing, it's almost like the states can block me from voting on a national issue. And it's almost like the states are superseding the national. And as a citizen, I mean, so I couldn't vote in Missouri for some reason. I'd have to go to Illinois where I could. But again, I'm voting on a national issue. I don't, you know, if they want to block me from local, that's one thing, but it just doesn't seem right.
Right. This is, you know, our federal form of government. It's a legal gray area. So that the Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate federal elections, to pass laws regulating federal elections, which Congress has done from time to time, particularly with the Voting Rights Act. I think, but to a large extent, Congress has left states, you know, kind of alone to pass their own voting laws, particularly regarding voter registration. And the U.S. Constitution gives states, also has a provision saying, you know, that states can set rules about voter eligibility. And so these sort of competing provisions, you know, leave a question, well, what can the federal government require versus what can states require, and who has the final say on these things? And often it ends up being the courts and the Supreme Court, the final say. And I think that's another concern here, is that the U.S. Supreme Court now has a 6-3 conservative majority, and a conservative majority that seems aligned with the Republican Party views on voter fraud and election laws, broadly speaking. And so if any kind of voting rights case makes it to the Supreme Court right now, I'm not real confident on the decision that they will make.
David, I've got a question about HR 1. Considering how many voting authorities there are in this country, and you go out to rural Missouri and they're still doing votes the way they did in 1900, paper ballot and manually counting them. What happens? How do you get a county like, say, Knox County, Missouri, to comply with all of these new rules and regulations, when first of all, they don't see they have a problem, and second of all, they don't have any local resources?
Yeah. Yeah, that you hit the nail on the head. That's a really, really big challenge. And so most of the local jurisdictions that administer elections are small, small in population, you know, have maybe 5,000 voters or less. And running elections on a small scale like that, it's generally been easy to keep doing things the way you've been doing. And so, yeah, people still register by filling out a paper card. Yeah, many of them still count ballots by hand. And the voters and the local officials in those small counties don't see the need to change the election laws, and they resist efforts to sort of modernize, right? But in places with a larger population, St. Louis County, St. Charles County, city of St. Louis, with, you know, hundreds of thousands of voters, doing voter registration by hand and counting ballots by hand, that's just not, that's not going to work anymore. Not at all. And it's a real challenge to find the balance there, to have laws and procedures that work for both. And I guess in my view, I would prefer state and federal laws to allow some flexibility so that the local jurisdictions can, you know, can kind of do what works best. But that's, you know, that doesn't always work either. you know, in the 2020 election, one of the big concerns we had was, and particularly in Missouri, was with a lot of people voting absentee for the first time and voting and voting by mail. You got to get the application in the mail first, fill it out, send it back. Then you get the ballot in the mail. You got to fill it out, send it back. Boy, there's lots of things that can go wrong there, and particularly, if the mail's delayed, your ballot arrives late, you're out. You're out of luck. It's not going to count. And Missouri has this notary requirement. If you don't notarize, all these details that trip people up. And we really worried that there were going to be a lot of absentee ballots that were rejected, not counted because voters, not familiar with the rules there. St. Louis County had one of the lowest rates of rejected absentee ballots in the state. And that was in part, I think we're fortunate in St. Louis County that we have very good, Rick Stream and Eric Fay, the two election directors, are really, really good, and have a, very customer service oriented outlook to doing their job. And they did a lot of innovative things in the election last year to try and help voters. And in particular, they had a system of notifying absentee voters if there was a problem when the ballot came back. Hey, you forgot to sign it. You want to come in and sign it, or wasn't notarized. You want to come in and notarize it before the election, so your ballot will count. They went to fairly great lengths to help voters through the process. Many other counties in Missouri didn't do that, and it's really hard to find a set of rules. So what, do we require the rural counties to do that too? Well, maybe they should. It's really a challenge to to determine, like, what should the rules be that sort of accommodates everybody. I noticed a question in the chat that asked about the bills in Missouri. The photo ID one, I believe, HB 738 has passed the House, and so it was awaiting action in the Senate. The other ones I don't think have yet passed the House, and so there's still a month to go or so in the legislative session in Missouri, so we'll see what happens there.
Question and a comment. Some of those Missouri bills require paper ballots to be counted by hand, which of course is impossible in St. Louis County, not only because of the number of voters, but because of some of the issues on the ballot, like when we do the judges. But I think, I'm not sure which ones, but some of those do have that provision in them. And I have a question about the laws that have passed in Arizona and Georgia that punish election officials. The most insidious part is that they allow the legislature in the middle of an election to remove officials and have the legislature appoint other people to run the election, which obviously is a way of literally overthrowing the voters' preference. Could you comment on what those provisions?
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I agree that those are disturbing. The Arizona one, I'm not quite as familiar on the details, but I know in Georgia, so Georgia has this provision that would allow legislature to replace a county official if they were unhappy with the county official's actions. And some of this is a response to the 2020 election. In some of the urban counties in both those states, the local election officials did some creative things to help people vote absentee. So, for example, in some places they had sort of a drive-through absentee voting. So you drive up, you don't have to get out of your car. They check your registration, you drop off your ballot. Election officials are there to take it, so it's secure. right? In the midst of a pandemic, like, wow, that seems like a clever idea, but it's now for the legislature to say, no, other counties didn't do that, so we don't like it that you did that, so we're not going to let you do that anymore. And if you try to do that, we're going to punish you. That's pretty disturbing. So yeah, I'm concerned about that. I think in Missouri, in terms of the requiring paper ballots and counted by hand, yeah, in a large county like St. Louis County, that's not very practicable. I think for me, the solution that makes sense is what are called risk limiting audits. And that is, after election, you randomly select, maybe 5% of the ballots and count those by hand and check that count matches the count that you got when you scanned the ballots to the machines. And if you get a discrepancy in that, then you go and you count more ballots by hand. But requiring a large county like St. Louis County to count all their ballots by hand always is counterproductive.
I see Terry has a question. Terry?
Maureen was before me.
Okay, can you hear me?
Miss Maureen. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, great. I had an argument with someone, so I tried to find the facts, and I found this Heritage Foundation that said there were, I think, 1,200 or 1,100 instances of voting fraud. And then I see the Brennan Center for Justice that disagrees with that. But the question I had, and it's a good paper, I just read it, it's a very good paper, but it doesn't say how many were Republican and how many were Democrat. I suspect that there's an equal number or not. I mean, I've heard in the news that 3 cases in Pennsylvania were actually Republicans trying to vote twice. Do you know if there's any kind of database or count? It's tough. It's going to be hard because I see in this Brennan paper that there's a lot of different variables of what is really voter fraud and what isn't.
Right. So yeah, the Heritage Foundation website. Yeah, you can check that out. They have a website where they claim to keep track of instances of voter fraud in the United States. And yeah, last I checked, it was somewhere around 1,100 or 1,200. But they're going back to like the 1980s. Their database goes all the, so it covers, 40 years at least of time to come up with that many, cases. And so, what you're talking about is, in a national election, nationwide, maybe 50 to 100 across the entire country. And the Heritage Foundation database is basically alleged voter fraud, right? Not all those cases were, led to an indictment or even a conviction.
Yeah.
So it's not clear that all those cases of alleged fraud were really voter fraud.
Correct.
For real. The database I've seen that's most reliable is an organization called News 21, which is the Arizona State University, their journalism school, which is one of the top journalism schools in the country. They organized a group of reporters to basically compile cases of voter fraud from local news reports all around the country for about a 10-year period covering about 2002 to 2012. So it's now out of date, but that was the best comprehensive effort I've seen in the United States. And, it had some, maybe 1,000 or so cases of different types, some were absentee fraud, some voter impersonation, people trying to vote twice and so forth. It was still a very, very, small number given, over a 10-year period, a billion people voted in national elections. And so, but that database, I haven't seen anyone that identifies, was it a Democrat, was it a Republican? In most of the news, in most of the news stories about this, and in most of the court documents, it doesn't reveal the person's partisan affiliation. And so I don't know, don't have any figures on that, on the partisan side of it.
I don't suppose the Heritage Fund, I got to go back and sort them by year so you can actually see for 2020. I have to go back and look.
I don't know if they do either.
Okay.
Or
Okay,
you may
you've
have to-
answered my question.
Yeah.
Terry?
Yeah, as Dave Steinberg points out in the chat, I had a letter to the editor published on Friday about the Georgia law, and it's the provisions that you pointed out, that the election officials can be changed by the legislature if they don't like the results or if they don't like the officials. But that's up to 4 jurisdictions in Georgia. And I pointed out in the letter that 4 jurisdictions, 4 counties in Georgia cast 1.63 million votes in the presidential election, a big number. And it would get Trump his 11,000 votes easily. My question is, will HR 1 nullify state election, state laws like that?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not entirely confident about this, but I don't think HR 1 would, because HR 1 has sort of specific things about voter registration and redistricting, but I don't think HR 1 gets into details of about specifically the administrative structure of running elections, and frankly, I don't know that Congress.
Well, the rest of it seems to me to be tinkering. The dangerous parts of the Georgia law aren't revealed by the media.
Right.
You got to dig into the law to find them.
Right. Yeah. And the Georgia law specifically goes after the 4 biggest counties in the state, which are the counties where Biden did better, and counties with large populations where the local officials had to be creative to try and pull off an election in the midst of a pandemic. Yeah. So it is very, that part is very disturbing to me. I think that's sort of taking these partisan fights to a whole new level.
Well, and then I'll give you a follow-up question. You talked about the lawsuits following the election. Are most of them about voter fraud, or are they about something else?
The lawsuits are about lots of different topics. The ones filed after the election are largely the lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign challenging the election outcomes and alleging voter fraud. There were maybe 60 or so of those. And the Trump campaign has basically lost every one of them because they failed to produce any significant evidence of voter fraud to justify their those lawsuits, right? So they lost them all. The lawsuits filed before the election were challenging the procedures and laws, set up prior to the election. Some of those were lawsuits from liberal groups, challenging states, arguing that the laws are too restrictive, particularly challenging, states that required voter ID, for example. But some of the lawsuits filed prior to the election were lawsuits from a conservative viewpoint, challenging laws that they thought were too permissive. So the lawsuits kind of cover a wide range of topics.
Thank you.
Okay, could we have one more question and then we need to go on to our other report? One more?
Oh, we have one more. Let's see. Okay. The Georgian law makes it a crime to offer food or drink to a person in line voting. Do you think a court would strike down that provision?
Good question. Yeah, right. That's another controversial part of the Georgia law. I certainly think the courts would take a close look at that, right? It really seems curious why. I mean, the stated reason they did that was to prevent, electioneering, prevent somebody influencing a voter right as they're about to go cast their ballot. Many states like Missouri have laws saying you can't talk to a voter, approach a voter within 50 feet of the polling place, right? There's sort of a zone of silence there, or whatever. I mean, I think that I guess in trying to put the best face of this, if I was in the Georgia legislature, that's the argument they made for.
Well, Governor Kemp said something about if people are hungry waiting in line, then they can use DoorDash or Uber Eats or something of
that
those.
seems ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah. One more time I hollered at the TV. Yeah.
You do with a whole pizza when you're standing in line and you can't get somebody else.
Well, I appreciate Dr. Kimball, you giving a shout out to the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. I was a poll worker in a poll observer in November. It was an interesting experience. However, they didn't send me really anywhere where there was any real action, or even by that point in the afternoon, there was really not any line that I was at. But yes, Karen Francis did mention she wanted to know the number to text for MOVPC. It's 66866 if you missed that. But we really appreciate you spending time with us this morning, Dr. Kimball. And everybody, give them a round of applause. Thank you. Continue your work. We appreciate you joining us. Okay, next, you're welcome to hang on for Glenn's legislative report. Glenn, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Here's a line about the 2010 election. You could be a total moron and get elected just by having an R next to your name. And that year, by the way, we did pick up a fair number in that category. That is former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, talking about his old members. And that was a decade ago, we now call the good old days. Basically, the Republican Party in Washington and in Jefferson City shows no interest in actually governing. They exist solely to try and mess things up. And we're seeing that from Mitch McConnell, where he's saying that he'll basically punish any Republican who even thinks about voting for the Biden infrastructure plan, to the way that they're demanding in the House of Representatives that all Republicans vote together. Ann Wagner made some votes that were not in the best interest of her district. But if she didn't vote against the Biden stimulus, for example, she could probably see herself losing her committee assignments and getting on the bad list with the House. Of course, at the same time, the Republicans are willing to die in the streets to protect the Trump tax cuts. There's a lot of misinformation, not just on Fox News, but in other places, about the way Biden's talking about changing the taxes on corporations to help pay for the infrastructure investment. The important thing to remember is that the biggest chunk of money comes from two things. One is a slight increase in the rate of taxation for corporations. And the second is getting rid of the offshore loophole. For example, a lot of companies like Facebook and so on, they are not American companies on tax day. They're registered in Bermuda, the Cayman Islands. I was reading where one was registered in the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. That allows them, by paying taxes there at a very low rate, to avoid paying taxes on the bulk of their income that comes from the United States and Europe. What Biden's proposing is that you have to pay taxes at a 15% rate, in other words, still a discounted rate, on the profits you report to the SEC and your investors. So that way Facebook could not launder a couple $1 billion a year off in an offshore account. This way, that's where a lot of money would come. That's money that really should be taxed now. If you have a restaurant in St. Louis, you can't afford to set up a Cayman Island account to handle your money. But the big corporations, including some who are defense contractors, do that all the time. Now, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News say this is the end of civilization as we know it because they're going to pass those costs on to consumers. Well, no, they're not, because that 15% tax rate comes out of their stated profit. So in other words, that's money they've made. Yes, it may mean a little bit less money for their investors, but in most cases nowadays, most big corporations do not pay dividends. Instead, the investors, to realize any gain, have to sell their stock. So that's important to watch. Another thing that's been happening that hasn't gotten much press is that Biden has expanded the food stamp program and some other things, which Trump actually did some nice things for during the pandemic. What that means in Missouri is the average food stamp benefit has increased by about $1 per person per meal. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it takes it from around $1.40 to around $2.50. And at $2.50 per person per meal, families have a lot better chance of putting good food on the table. They're still going to need food pantry help, but it makes a tremendous difference in their situation. Also, let's not forget that extra $1 per person per meal going across the nation, that puts more than $4 billion a month more ringing through grocery store registers. So even these things like food stamps that they like to call welfare have a big economic impact as far as what's it mean for people in St. Louis, for people in Columbia, Missouri, and everywhere else. Biden did get lucky. He came across a very friendly Senate parliamentarian who's going to allow them to use reconciliation more broadly. What that means is Biden has a chance to pass big parts of his infrastructure package with 50 votes and the vice president, rather than having hit that 60-vote Senate threshold. And while there's a lot of talk about changing the filibuster, it's unlikely the filibuster will go away. What may happen is the filibuster goes back to being back in Frank Capra's era, a senator standing on the floor and talking for 36 hours. That happens in Jefferson City all the time. It would be fun to see the United States Senate, which has many members over age 80, trying to hold the floor for 2 or 3 days to kill legislation. One other thing to remember too, all this money Biden's talking about he's given out for the stimulus, and he's talking about for transportation, for infrastructure, for broadband, while the Senate is against it, while the House is against it, not one Republican governor has gone on record as saying, we won't take that money from Washington. Every governor wants the money. Every Republican governor wants that money, including Mike Parson here in Missouri. Give you an idea too, some of the little things we're seeing that Trump, the little minefields he left in the federal bureaucracy. Here's one that came to my attention. The USDA has an office that does background checks on their critical employees because they get a lot of confidential information, financial information on farmers and people getting loans from them, information on crops and so on. The USDA unit that does those background checks had been stripped of most of their staff. They're now 2 years behind doing background checks. But the people are doing their jobs who haven't passed a background check because they need the people in the jobs. So let's hope that they're only hiring good, honest people, because the system that's supposed to protect us isn't working as well as it should. Back in Missouri, for the first time in many years, Missouri has money. General revenue is running about $1 billion ahead of this time last year. Now, part of that is because we extended the tax filing last year. So a lot of money that should have gone in fiscal year 20 didn't get paid to fiscal year 21. But also, it turns out one of the reasons that individual income tax soared was because Missouri taxes unemployment benefits. And a lot of people in the hospitality industry who got those stimulus checks, stimulus benefits on unemployment, were paying taxes on a higher rate because some of them made more than they usually do. But in many cases, a lot of these people were tipped employees who may not have been as honest about paying their taxes as some others of us. And as a result, their tax shield went way up. Plus, Missouri has their own version of offshore accounts, off the book accounts, where they've stashed a lot of the federal stimulus money. What that means is this year, there is no excuse for the legislature not to fund things adequately because they have much more money to spend. Despite that, they're doing a lot of game playing with money. The most egregious example, the House Budget Committee decided they were not going to fund Medicaid expansion. Not only did they not fund Medicaid expansion, they took the $130 million plus Parson put in the budget for Medicaid expansion, and they created an improper new bill. The speaker or the committee chair, Cody Smith of Carthage, did. He created House Bill 21, an appropriations bill created after the deadline for new legislation. And it took the money that was set aside for Medicaid and divvied it up to things like school transportation, some home health care, and all these other projects. So in other words, they're trying to deny the governor the ability to fund Medicaid because there's no appropriation for it, and the governor cannot spend money that's not appropriated. What that means is we're going to see lawsuits on what's going to happen about Medicaid expansion. The good news is it's in the state constitution, and eventually Medicaid is going to get expanded. But let's look at who's going to be representing Missouri in that lawsuit. Governor Parson, who said he'd fund it but is against Medicaid, and Eric Schmidt, the Attorney General, who thinks it's illegal. Would you want to have a lawyer defending you who thinks you're guilty? That's the situation we're going to have. We're going to have Eric Schmidt going to court to defend the state constitution, something he doesn't really believe in. So what I'm afraid of is that despite the lawsuits, despite the Constitution, the 250,000 or so Missourians who should get access to medical coverage on July 1st may not see it happen until 2022, 2023, or maybe even 2024, because these things can be gummed up in court a long time. They can be gummed up in the state courts. And remember, legislation or lawsuits against the state go to Cole County. Cole County elects their judges as Democrats and Republicans. There's 1 Democrat and 4 Republicans. A couple of those Republicans fit John Boehner's definition of 2010 legislators. So we have some problems there. Let's remember too that the Missouri legislature has the capability of doing a lot of stupid stuff before anybody notices. Here are some of my favorites on the list right now. House Bill 52, allowing concealed carry on Metro and other public transportation. It is very possible this is going to pass and get signed by the governor. So we'll have a situation where security guards at a Metrolink station are not armed, but the passengers are. So maybe somebody will loan a gun to the security guard if something happens. House Bill 85, the Second Amendment Preservation Act. The Missouri legislature is saying we know better how to interpret the US Constitution than the Supreme Court of the United States. The Second Amendment Preservation Act would make it illegal for a sheriff or police chief to have his staff cooperate with the federal government. One example, somebody gets pulled over, the police run them, they found out they're a felon, they're a convicted felon, they have a gun. Missouri would no longer enforce the federal regulation that convicted felons cannot have firearms. So then your sheriff would have to tell his people, you have to let them go along, drive off with their gun. That's a little scary. On top of that, we could have Missouri-built machine guns in all of our cars because of HB 85. Also, there's a push by the House to limit what public health authorities can do. For example, we've seen what's going on in St. Louis County, St. Louis City, and the other major counties where the health departments have come in and said, look, we need to close this down. We need to do this and that to protect the public. Traditionally, going back to 1918, remember in 1918, the health commissioner in St. Louis City even closed churches. Well, under this bill, their ability to do that would be severely limited. And what would happen is that the power would go back either to the county council or the appropriate local authority or to the state legislature in certain circumstances. Remember, we had the situation in Jefferson County where they resisted a mask mandate and other restrictions, even though their health director wanted it, because they have a county health board. And the county health board has two people who are known anti-vaxxers, and they were able to slow things down in Jefferson County. That could be happening statewide. We could have a situation where the governor would have to call a special legislative session so that in a pandemic, we would continue to do common sense things like wearing masks. By the way, Missouri has never enacted a statewide mask mandate. As David was pointing some of the restrictions on initiative petitions, the two that bother me the most are a $500 filing fee to start a petition and changing the requirement from 8% of voters in the gubernatorial election in 6 of the 8 congressional districts to 10% of voters in all 8 districts. That effectively doubles the number of signatures you would need to get on the ballot. Then they would make it harder by raising the threshold, how many votes you needed. Instead of 50% plus 1, you would probably need close to 57% to get something enacted, which still would have brought in Clean Missouri, by the way. Also, for educators, they're once again revising the idea that students should be able to go to any school they want to. This year's voluntary transfer bill is not as broad as they've tried before, but it would still mean that every school district would have to declare how many transfer students it could take. And those numbers would be audited by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So if, say, the Clayton School District said, we have room for 87 more kids, DESE could say, no, you have to take 300. And then parents who provided their own transportation could have their kids move from, say, the Normandy School District or the Pattonville School District to go to Clayton schools. Some of the money would go with them, but that would be a big problem for local public authorities, for local schools. This is tied into the same people who want to have the voucher systems, who want to have state subsidies for homeschooling and things like that. We need to keep an eye on that. Another thing they're doing, which ought to really bother some of us, is they're tinkering with the St. Louis County sales tax pool. House Bill 554 would put in state law how the money gets divided among the municipalities on the sales tax pool, and it would put more money into the pool. We've had this argument for years between cities like Chesterfield and Fenton, who have gone hog wild on development, versus cities like Webster Groves, which have limited development, and where the sales tax money goes. That's going to be a hot button issue. It's going to have a lot of impact at the local level, and it looks like it's already passing the House, and it looks like it's going to have traction in the Senate. Now, Meanwhile, speaking of the Senate, Senator Whelan from down in Jefferson County got the Senate to pass an amendment which says that Missouri Medicaid will not pay for any birth control, period. Now, we're not talking about funding abortions. We're not talking about funding morning after pills. We're talking about any birth control. That would put Missouri out of compliance with the federal regulations for Medicaid. That means that Missouri could lose the hundreds of millions of dollars we get a month to help subsidize Medicaid, not with the Medicaid expansion money. That would be off the table too. But Missouri would be legally required to have a Medicaid program. We wouldn't get the money from the feds to pay for a lot of it. Also, the Senate has a measure going through it right now, which is already passed as an amendment from Igo and Onder, the two of the conservative caucus members from St. Charles County. It would exempt Jefferson County, St. Charles County, and Lincoln County from the emissions testing. That would put Missouri out of compliance with the rules from the EPA, and the end result was Missouri would lose $52 million a year in transportation funds. And yet they're doing it anyway because the conservative caucus thinks it's too much of a burden for people who aren't in the polluting areas. They try to say that 400,000 people in St. Charles County and 300,000 in Jefferson County aren't adding to the pollution in the metro area. That's called Senate Bill 40, by the way. Meanwhile, the conservative caucus, which, like I said, includes Igo and Onder from St. Charles County, Mike Moon, who used to be in the House, and Andrew Koenig from West St. Louis County, they are pushing to eliminate the personal property tax. Some states have done that. However, there's been state replacement mechanisms to support that. Under the Missouri rule that they're talking about, in a few years, it would be illegal for a county to levy a personal property tax. What that would mean is that all of a sudden, on one day, local schools would lose about $1 billion in local funding. Because the biggest part of personal property tax, like the biggest part of your real estate tax, goes to local schools. So this is something they're saying because they're against taxes and so on. But what it would do would be put a huge burden on local taxpayers, because guess what? If you take tens of millions of dollars away from the Parkway School District, they either have to make ungodly cuts on short notice, or they have to go to taxpayers and raise the levy on real estate. So that is one of those things they're doing because they're against taxes. They also have like 9 proposals to lower the state income tax by little bits and large amounts. Remember too, we still haven't passed the Wayfair fix. In other words, we would collect that sales tax from companies like Wayfair and the other internet merchants. The Missouri Chamber of Commerce is for that. Local merchants are for that. But because Missouri has not passed the Wayfair fix, my wife and I bought an entertainment center last year. My wife got a check from Wayfair for 35 cents, a refund on the taxes they withheld that they found out now they don't have to pay for a year. So we live in Missouri. We can probably literally call ourselves the backward state. As always, we think the answer to every problem is more guns, less tax money. The Missouri legislature also is going to be working on redistricting. However, that's going to wind up being done in a special session because the numbers from the Census Bureau won't be available until the end of September. And if they try to follow the traditional timeline, they'll need to publish their new guidelines and get them through the courts in time when filing opens in February of next year for state offices. So that's going to be wild. We also know from what the Republicans are saying is they think there are too many Democrats in the legislature. And so since we've gotten rid of Clean Missouri and that idea of a neutral, honest state demographer, we're going back to a partisan system, and the Republicans are already planning to make it as partisan as possible. And so we're going to see a lot of upsets We're going to see a lot of new strange district lines. And probably, again, since they go to court in Cole County, we're not going to get good judicial oversight to enforce the rules that are even there as far as compactness of districts, keeping municipalities together where possible, not crossing county lines where possible. On that depressing note, are there any questions? No questions? The bill that's removing
The bill that would remove birth control from Medicaid, did that have a bill number to it? Senate bill?
It has a Senate bill number. It came down by a surprise. It was Senator Whelan's amendment. You'll be hearing a lot about it in the press in the next couple of weeks. Planned Parenthood, I think, is putting out an advisory about it this week. But that one, the Democrats even admitted they didn't really stand up against it because they didn't think it had a shot.
It's in today's Post. There's an article.
Okay, thank you. I haven't opened my newspaper yet, sorry.
Is there any way you can put together a list of these items so that we could write to our congressmen or representatives?
Sure. Many of them are listed in the report I put out. Also, things change very quickly in Jefferson City. The best way to track legislation this time of the session is to go to the House website, and it'll have a list of bills. If you go on there, you go to legislation, it'll have a list of bills that are third read. That means they've been passed by the House. That list is only about 120 bills right now, and a lot of them are for very non-consequential things. Those are the bills that have been sent to the Senate and have a chance. You can also go to the Senate and look at their actions, see what bills they've been passing, but it's hard to keep up on the numbers. One thing we've seen a lot of this year and the last few years has been bad ideas getting combined. Last session, we had one bill that had components of 25 other bills in it. In other words, as things get close to the finish line, or else they start combining things, it's going to be even worse next year because a lot of legislators are going to want to have their name on a piece of legislation that passes. And so you're going to see a lot of crazy bills come out with 25 co-sponsors and parts of 30 or 40 bills, so everybody can get something for their campaign literature. That's why, I don't cite a lot of bill numbers, because you have to watch the content usually, and watch the Missouri Independent, the Missouri Times, the Columbia Missourian newspaper. Those three have the best coverage of what's going on in Jefferson City. The Columbia Missourian, that's the paper done by the students at Mizzou Journalism School. Online especially, they have a lot of long articles about what's going on in the House and Senate. The Missouri Independent, their main writer now is Jason Hancock, who for many years was the star of Jefferson City coverage for the Kansas City Star. And the Missouri Times is conservative, but they generally at least give you the facts and the numbers. Sometimes their commentaries and their viewpoint is to the other side of a lot of us, but they're very good at getting the facts out. But again, don't get too hung up on the numbers, follow the content. And unfortunately, we've had a lot of crazy things happen in Jeff City. Again, like House Bill 21 should never have been allowed to be created, much less voted on. And that was a party line vote by committee and basically a party line vote on the floor of the House. That was something that shouldn't have happened because of after the deadline to create new bills. The other thing too is it really ties the governor's hands, and it really makes Medicaid expansion bad. But by not following the rules and enforcing their own rules, they were able to get that through. So, any other questions?
Who calls them on that when they do that stuff?
Nobody. Because the Speaker of the House can control matters going to the parliamentarian, who's a Republican appointee, and a legislator can really not go to court on a ruling of the parliamentarian or a ruling of the Speaker. And since they have a veto-proof majority, even if you have a good point, the odds are you're not going to get the votes to get it reconsidered or overturned. The other thing too, if you ever listen to a Missouri House session, some days when they're doing voice votes, you'll hear 10 or 12 votes in a row where it really sounds like by the noise level, the measure failed. And the speaker will go passed, 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 you know. The speaker has very selective ears. And many times, even things his own party wants, if they're not on his agenda, they don't happen. That's the system we've got.
So depressing.
Sorry.
Guess we're the watchdogs.
The watchdogs, but to show you what it's like up there, talk to any of your Missouri legislators who are Democrats, and then look out online. You can watch them in session, and you'll see that most of the Republicans don't social distance, they don't wear masks, and they are very reality and truth impaired in a lot of the things they say on the floor of the House.
Well, thank you, Glenn. I guess. Thank you. Thank you for your research. Okay. All right. I guess that's it for the month of April. We hope to see you on Monday, May 10th. Same time, same place, and unless they open up the Union Hall, which doesn't appear to be likely in the next 4 weeks. But hopefully you're all on the track to get vaccinated if you're not already vaccinated, and take care till we see you next time.